Welcome back, viewers, to another episode of A Monstrous October, the show which is always happy to help you return to that wonderful world of gods and monsters. Now we've come to it, the film that many consider the apotheosis of the Universal Classic Monsters series. Yes, prepare yourselves one and all to once more journey alongside mad doctors and the resurrected dead. Prepare yourselves for The Bride of Frankenstein.
She's gone! The monster! He's got her!
They, whoever they are, like to say that sequels are never as good as the original. And don't get me wrong, there are plenty of terrible sequels out there that one can name as proof of this particular saying. Hell, a good number of the films we'll be getting to in the course of this series would work as examples if it came to that. Yet not all of them. And when you consider that the first sequel in the Universal Monster series not only is as good as the original, but is actually even better, well, perhaps it's not that much of a surprise after all that Universal ended up going back to the well so many times before all was said and done. Bride opens with the first example of what will end up becoming a common trope in both the Universal Monster series and horror sequels in general. The retconning of the seemingly inescapable death of the monster, or monsters, from the last film. Despite being crushed by flaming timbers and burning to death at the end of the first movie, the monster Frankenstein in fact actually survived by somehow developing a previously non-existent resistance to fire and heat. Just go with it. Trust me, this is far from the most bullshit resurrection a Universal monster will undergo before this series is done. Also, while the first film seemed to end with all good and well in the House of Frankenstein, Bride soon reveals that in point of fact, nothing could be further from the truth. For Dr. Henry Frankenstein has not given up on his quest to unlock the very secrets of life and death, and his fiancée Elizabeth is convinced that these desires will only bring death and despair down upon them both. It's at this point that Henry's previously unknown mentor, Dr. Pretorius, arrives, and Henry is soon pressured into helping Pretorius create a bride for the monster, so as to bring about, as Pretorius famously puts it, a new world of gods and monsters. Joined soon by the monster himself, who can now somewhat talk thanks to education from a kindly blind man, events soon spiral out of control, as they always tend to in these movies, until one final climactic encounter between all involved plays out alongside the backdrop of a dark and stormy night. In the original 1933 Frankenstein, the monster's behavior remained fairly ill-defined and even contradictory at times, but Bride tightens up the character and gives him a proper arc to boot. It quickly becomes clear that Frankenstein the monster is not an explicitly evil creature, and instead his more violent tendencies occur when he's threatened or startled, like the same way a newborn reacts by crying to a loud noise disturbing its sleep. Ultimately, the monster's behavior stems from a lack of awareness of the ways of the world around him, and this of course leads to the classic scene between the monster and the blind man I've already alluded to, and it's here where the seeds are planted for the film's tragic climax. Much like the character of the Hulk, who would years later draw heavily upon the Frankenstein story for inspiration, the monster is a character who wants to be both left alone and embraced by those around him. Neither truly dead nor alive, monster or man, hero or villain, the film expertly presents a figure who exists between all worlds simultaneously and can belong to none as a result. Returning from the original film is, of course, Boris Karloff as the monster, along with Colin Clive as Dr. Frankenstein, while behind the camera, James Whale reprises his role as director. They're joined by Ernest Thesiger as the infamous Dr. Pretorius, Valerie Hobson, who takes over the part of Elizabeth Lavanza for May Clark, and Elsa Lanchester, who does double duty as first Mary Shelley herself in the film's opening, before taking on the role of the titular bride in the film's climax. It's a terrific cast, and even more so than the original film, Bride stands as a true ensemble piece, where for once, the monster du jour does not simply steal the show. Thesiger's Pretorius, in particular, stands out as one of the great inventions of the Universal Monster canon, what with his over-the-top proclamations and cold and calculating machinations. The character and his actor also help bring a sense of camp to the film that, far from undercutting the story, instead helps ratchet up the sense of the inhumanly bizarre and strange that pervades much of Bride. And then there's James Whale, who even in these relatively early days in the medium was already a passionate lover of film. One famous example of how this love made him a better filmmaker involves his first meeting with Claude Rains, upon the latter being cast as the Invisible Man. Learning that Rains had only ever seen 6 films in his entire life to that point, Whale immediately ordered the former stage actor to go see more movies, at least 3 a day, so that he would know something about film. By all accounts, filmmaking wasn't just a job for Wales, it was a passion, and one that would bear its ultimate fruits for the man with The Bride of Frankenstein. While he would go on to direct numerous films after Bride, including the seminal 1936 classic Showboat and the 1939 version of The Man in the Iron Mask that would, among other things, introduce the world to Peter Cushing, he never could quite match his final Universal Monster film in terms of either quality or influence, and it stands as a towering accomplishment to this day. Much has been made in recent years of the supposed gay subtext of Bride, and there's no denying the character of Dr. Pretorius was written in a way to mark him as a coded homosexual. And of course, Whale himself was openly homosexual in a time where very few dared to be so, but those who knew Whale best deny that he explicitly set out to make Bride as some sort of allegory for the way at the time, and even all too often today if it comes to that, society would attempt to crush out homosexuality as some sort of monstrous aberration. Indeed, Whale's longtime companion and film producer David Lewis has outright stated that Whale's sexual orientation was not germane to his filmmaking. He went on to say that, quote, Jimmy was first and foremost an artist, and his films represented the works of an artist. Not a gay artist, but an artist, end quote. And taken in that context from the man who knew Whale best among all, far be it from me to disagree. What I will say is that like many great works of fiction, Bride of Frankenstein is a film of great depth that consequently leaves it open to a myriad of interpretations, none of which are necessarily right or wrong. We'll never really know for sure what was in Whale's mind as he worked on the film, and that's probably for the best, since ultimately it matters little in terms of the film's quality. Over the years, I've seen Bride of Frankenstein dozens of times, and I'm sure I'll see it dozens more in the years to come as well. It's simply one of those films that will give an audience something new to appreciate every time they watch it, and at the risk of descending into cliché, if you were only to ever see a single Universal Monster film, this should absolutely be the one. And that's going to do it for this episode of A Monstrous October. Come back tomorrow as we meet the first werewolf to appear in a Universal Monster film, even if he isn't the one you were likely expecting. But such is the way it goes for The Werewolf of London.